Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. It's an honour to present my report. Over the past year, the misuse of laws and narratives to counter-terrorism continued unabated. I joined 110 communications to member states on all continents and almost 60 press releases raising diverse human rights concerns, from war crimes to transnational repression to protecting victims of terrorism, including hostages. Concerns were also addressed to responsible companies and non-state armed groups. I participated actively in the busy Global Counter-terrorism Coordination Compact and United Nations counterterrorism bodies in New York. I advocated for and welcomed the Security Council's adoption of a permanent humanitarian exemption to counterterrorism sanctions, and I now urge its full implementation at a time when foreign aid flows are drastically falling. Geographically, I paid special attention to counterterrorism in Africa, including country visits to Benin and Côte d'Ivoire, and I thank both governments for their constructive participation. I also undertook academic visits focusing on African regional institutions, along with regional organizations in other parts of the world, including the European Union, Council of Europe, NATO, and the League of Arab States, plus ASEAN, and I thank all of them for their cooperation. I also focused on the persistent violations of international law during the related armed conflicts in the Middle East, including in Israel and Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and Yemen. My present report focuses on the protection of human rights by regional organizations while countering terrorism. It's a sequel to my report on the same topic to the General Assembly last October, and the reports should be read together. The counterterrorism activities of regional organizations have not received adequate scrutiny, despite their profound impacts on human rights and their growing importance as counterterrorism actors. Regional organizations should never undermine civil and political freedoms, impede economic and social rights, or amplify domestic repression. Instead, they should vigorously use their capacities and peer pressure to strengthen human rights amongst member states. My report addresses three key issues. First, I encourage regional organizations to more meaningfully engage with diverse civil society organizations on counterterrorism, addressing the conditions conducive to terrorism and monitoring and remedying human rights violations. Engaging civil society enhances the transparency and legitimacy of counterterrorism measures, builds public confidence and security cooperation, and ultimately makes counterterrorism more effective. Some key recommendations on this front include: 1, publicizing accessible information about entry points and processes for engagement; 2, avoiding unduly restrictive accreditation and registration criteria for civil society; 3, providing adequate funding and administrative assistance to support engagement; and 4, protecting against reprisals and intimidation for engaging with regional organizations. I also encourage the United Nations counterterrorism bodies to condition their cooperation with regional organizations on adequate civil society engagement in all programming. Secondly, my report cautions that the use of regional sanctions against individual terrorists or terrorist organizations must fully respect human rights law, given the acute risks of sanctions of misuse against human rights defenders, civil society, journalists, and political activists. Regional definitions of terrorism used to list individuals or entities must be consistent with the principle of legality and best practice international standards on definition. There must be rigorous due process safeguards, independent review, and effective remedies for violations. Any restrictive measures imposed must be strictly necessary and proportionate and not applied on an automatic or indiscriminate basis. Regional human rights bodies should also be involved in the scrutiny of listings. Thirdly, my report encourages regional military cooperation against terrorism, from capacity building and technical assistance to peacekeeping and combat operations, to respect applicable international law. There are some positive practices in the African Union, European Union, and North Atlantic Treaty Organization, amongst others. Regional missions must respect the prohibition on the use of force as strictly interpreted by the International Court of Justice. They must recognise at the organisational level that they are bound by customary international humanitarian law and human rights law, and that they bear legal responsibility for violations by their organs and agents. Regional organisations should adopt comprehensive frameworks and procedures on compliance with humanitarian law and the protection of civilians. They should independently investigate alleged violations and make reparation and pay compensation for violations. They should act decisively where troop-contributing countries fail to address violations. They should also assess human rights risks in advance of and during missions, including when partnering with host states or other third states. They must scrupulously respect best practice international standards when supplying arms or munitions. They should be transparent in publicly reporting on their operations. Regional missions, critically, should also always be part of a comprehensive response to terrorism that addresses the root causes of conflict, including, importantly, state violations of human rights, including when countering terrorism, along with poor governance, and ensure that missions enable, not impede, peacemaking and reconciliation. As mentioned, the present report is a sequel to my earlier report to the General Assembly in October. In brief, in that report, I urged regional organisations to review and revise overbroad terrorism definitions and offences to prevent abuse. Secondly, to ensure regional cooperation, legal cooperation on extradition, mutual assistance and intelligence sharing respects human rights, particularly non-refoulement, privacy and data protection. Thirdly, I urge regional organisations to preventively apply human rights due diligence policies. Next, to ensure that they have human rights and gender expertise amongst their staff, and further to adequately fund the mainstreaming of human rights within counter-terrorism activities. I further recommended that regional organisations improve transparency and public reporting about their counter-terrorism activities, enhance oversight and accountability, including remedies for violations. Most regional organisations could also do much more to assist victims of terrorism. The United Nations, too, must ensure that its many proliferating forms of counter-terrorism engagement with regional organisations advance, not undermine, human rights, particularly when equipping regional organisations with new security powers, tools and technologies. Madam President, it's now my honour to present my report on my country visit to Benin in November last year. I thank the Government of Benin for its invitation and its positive cooperation. Benin's openness is a model for other states who appear to be very shy about accepting my requests to visit. I express my sympathy with the people and government of Benin, in particular for the recent cross-border attack that killed at least 30 people in the north of the country. I commend Benin for adopting a comprehensive counter-terrorism strategy that strengthens its security response while addressing the conditions conducive to terrorism and improving human rights. The government is promoting development in historically neglected border regions, increasing access to basic services and infrastructure like schools and hospitals, combating stigmatisation of marginalised groups and settling land disputes, generously welcoming refugee victims of terrorism from the Sahel, and reforming its criminal justice system. I also acknowledge the professionalism of its security forces and efforts to build trust with affected communities. In suggesting improvements, I encourage Benin to narrow and clarify its definition of terrorism and terrorist offences to encompass only acts that are genuinely terrorist according to best practice international standards. Efforts to reduce arbitrary arrests and protracted pre-trial detention and to ensure access to legal representation and fair trial should also be strengthened. I further urge Benin to accelerate its existing efforts to address serious prison overcrowding and ensure detention conditions are humane according to international standards. Assistance to victims of terrorism could also be more institutionalised at the legal level. To assist Benin in preventing the spread of terrorism, I urge the international community to co-invest with the government in increasing assistance to displaced persons and host communities, promoting development and economic rights in vulnerable border areas, and strengthening the regulation of religious schools to prevent child exploitation. I also encourage Benin to strengthen oversight and accountability mechanisms relevant to countering terrorism and to remove any unjustified restrictions that prevent civil society and the media from commenting on security and human rights issues. Madam President, to conclude, we meet at a time of relentless attacks on the international norms and institutions that are central to my mandate to protect human rights while countering terrorism. These include aggressive uses of force and illegal annexations of foreign territory and threats thereof, as well as rampant international crimes and complicity in them by those who arm, finance, and politically shield them. They also include attacks on international institutions, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, and the United Nations as a whole, from the Secretary General to some of my fellow Special Procedures mandate holders. Our institutions are also faltering by neglect due to debilitating underfunding by member states. I emphasise that the abysmal political failure to address the conditions conducive to violence in Palestine or to challenge the impunity prevailing there has condemned the whole region's people to an endless cycle of suffering and vengeance. There can never be a sustainable peace without justice according to international law, including the right to self-determination. The apocalyptic violence in Palestine also signals to other states that there may be no consequences for decimating whole civilian societies while fighting terrorism, returning us to the scorched earth tactics of the colonial counter-insurgency era. I urge all countries to unite against coercion by major powers that seeks to break the international legal system and the peace and protection of human rights that it offers. Do not seek refuge in bilateral deal-making in the hope that your own country will be spared. Bullies respond only to strength. Strength in numbers, standing together, is our greatest hope. Thank you.